But if you had to change, improve in some way, what would be the one thing that you would go after in the ESA right now?
Tom, I have thought a lot about the law. And I understand that when we pass a law, given that it doesn't answer all the questions that will come up when the law is being implemented, we then have to expect the agencies principally involved in implementation of the law to develop rules that begin to fill in the gaps created by the broad language of the law. So it's not just enough to look at the Endangered Species Act and ask how can it be improved. You also have to look at what rules and regulations the United States Fish and Wildlife Service has developed to fill in the gaps created by the broad language of the Endangered Species Act. And so when I look at improving the Act, I look at both the language of the law itself, how the law itself might be amended, and how we might modify the rules and regulations that guide the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on a daily basis as they implement the broad language of the Endangered Species Act. And probably the one thing I would do is make sure that Fish and Wildlife Service policy and regulations are very clear on the point, and maybe the only way to achieve sufficient clarity would be then to further amend the Endangered Species Act to make this clear yet again. And the clarity I would seek concerns this notion of significant portion of range. I think we can all agree range is meant to refer to historic range. So that's not a big problem in my mind. There's lots of people that do not agree on what constitutes significant portion. And I don't think there's any way in the world you can look at the law, you can look at the congressional testimony that was delivered by witnesses and our elected officials as well during the early 70s when the law was built, and congressional intent's important, and there's no way you can look at subsequent rules and regulations developed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and conclude anything other than significant portion of range is a really big deal. It has to include a spatial component, how much area is occupied, and we would have to agree in every respect significant has to mean more than insignificant, or it would simply be insignificant. And so for the most part, you got to connect to a little more than half of historic range. Because if you don't, you're not connecting to a significant portion of historic range. It's less than half. How can less than half be more significant than more than half? So we got to work in this notion of significant portion. It has a spatial component. 51%, I think, in the minds of everybody would be more significant than 49%. Additionally, when you look at everything upon which the Endangered Species Act is based and subsequent rules and regulations, you have to conclude significant portion also includes an ecological component. And when you look at these areas over which gray wolves are being recovered, you find typically several different biotic settings, several different types of landscapes, several different biomes. And if there's 6 different ecological settings in the northern Rocky Mountains, for example, and we need gray wolves to occupy a significant number of them, well, gee whiz, it would seem to me that 4 is more significant than 2. And 3, given there's only 6, maybe 3 is good enough, that's at least half. But you can't just have gray wolves in one of them, because that would mean that they're absent from 5 of them. And I don't think anybody would argue that 5 is insignificant compared to 1. So we need to apply a very common sense interpretation to this notion of significant portion. It's got to have a spatial aspect to it, got to have an ecological aspect to it, and that's the one area of the Endangered Species Act that I would work to clarify, because there seems to be some real lingering debate and uncertainty about what significant portion actually means.